He didn't come home with a medal, he came home with a secret. And for 7 years, he kept it perfectly, smiling at the right moments, showing up when it mattered, fixing what was broken around the house while everything inside him stayed shattered. To the outside world, Sergeant Daniel Reeves was a good man doing a noble thing. But Daniel knew the truth. He wasn't noble, he was hiding. And the place he chose to hide was the one place in the world that hurt the most, inside the family of the man he couldn't save. This is not a story about war, though war is where it begins. This is a story about a promise, about guilt that outlives the battlefield, about a mother who knew the truth long before her son's best friend had the courage to speak it, and about what it really means to come home, not just in body, but in soul. Some men leave the military and move on. They find jobs, start families, put the uniform in a box and push it to the back of the closet. They go to cookouts on the 4th of July and stand a little straighter when the national anthem plays, and that's the most the war ever surfaces again. Daniel Reeves was not one of those men. He couldn't be, because the war hadn't just taken something from him, it had left something behind. A debt he didn't know how to repay, a face he couldn't stop seeing, and a voice he heard every single morning when he first opened his eyes. Promise me anyway. 2 words. A lifetime of wait. Daniel grew up in Valdosta, Georgia, the kind of small town where everybody knows your name and your business and your grandfather's business too. His father worked at a lumber yard. His mother cleaned houses on the north side of town 3 days a week. They weren't poor exactly, but money was always a conversation at the dinner table. Careful, measured, never quite enough. He was the kind of kid who was good at everything but exceptional at nothing, which meant he floated through high school without much direction. He played baseball junior year, quit senior year. He got decent grades, not great ones. He had friends, not a crowd. He was likable, steady, the kind of boy that teachers remembered fondly, but couldn't always place a face to the name years later. What Daniel had, more than anything, was a sense of duty. It came from his father, who had served briefly in the early 90s and spoke about it rarely, but carried it always. It came from the way his dad stood a little differently when a military funeral procession passed through town. It came from a feeling Daniel couldn't quite name, that he was meant to be part of something bigger than Valdosta, Georgia. He enlisted in the Army at 18, 2 weeks after high school graduation. His mother cried at the kitchen table. His father shook his hand and held it a second longer than usual. "Come back whole," his father said. Daniel didn't fully understand what that meant then. He would spend the rest of his life learning. Basic training at Fort Benning was where Daniel first discovered what he was made of, and also where he met Marcus Webb. Marcus was everything Daniel was not. Loud where Daniel was quiet, expressive where Daniel held back, from Ohio, which might as well have been a foreign country, to a boy from deep South Georgia. He talked about his mother the way most guys talked about sports. He talked about his little sister Layla with a fierceness that made it clear she was the reason for everything. He was 20 years old, built like a man who'd worked construction since he was 15, and he had a laugh that could fill a room and embarrass strangers. They became friends the way soldiers do, fast and deep and without much ceremony. There isn't time for slow friendship in the Army. You trust a man with your life before you ever trust him with your secrets, and somewhere along the way, the order reverses. By the time they were deployed together to Afghanistan in early 2007, Daniel and Marcus had been friends for 3 years. They had been through training together, a brief deployment to Iraq together, and more late nights in barracks talking about life, family, fear, and the future than either of them could count. Marcus knew about Daniel's father's drinking. Daniel knew about the man who had broken Marcus's mother's heart when Marcus was 9 years old, and how Marcus had quietly, silently vowed to become the kind of man that would never do that to a woman. They knew each other the way people only know each other when they've been stripped down to the basics. No pretense, no performance, just two human beings trying to get through something hard without losing themselves. Afghanistan tested that in ways neither of them was prepared for. The Korangal Valley in 2007 was not a place. It was a condition. Soldiers who served there described it the same way years later, in different cities, in different lives. That valley got inside you. The mountains were brutal and beautiful at the same time, steep ridgelines that made every patrol feel like you were walking into something that had been waiting for you long before you arrived. The Taliban knew those mountains the way Daniel knew the roads around Valdosta. They used them like a second skin. The Americans had firepower, training, air support. The enemy had patience, terrain, and the kind of commitment that comes from fighting in your own backyard. The unit took their first casualty 2 weeks in. A kid from Texas named Garrett, 21 years old, stepped wrong on a hillside path, and that was it. Just like that, here and then not. The speed of it was the thing nobody prepared you for. One moment a person exists completely, breathing, talking, complaining about the food, and the next moment, the space they occupied is just air. Daniel and Marcus didn't talk about Garrett much after. Not because they didn't feel it, because they felt it too much. The mission that changed everything happened in late April, a reconnaissance patrol into a valley sector that intelligence suggested was being used as a supply route. 8 men. Routine, as much as anything in Korangal was routine. They were 3 miles in when everything went wrong. The ambush came from the high ground. It always came from the high ground. And within the first 45 seconds, 2 men were wounded, and the unit was pinned down behind whatever cover they could find. Daniel and Marcus ended up behind a disabled Humvee that had been stripped for parts months ago, left on the hillside like a rusted skeleton. The radio was damaged. Air support was 12 minutes out. 12 minutes is a very long time when rounds are hitting metal 2 feet from your head. Marcus was hit in the first exchange, a graze along his left arm that bled badly but wasn't fatal. He wrapped it himself without saying a word, with the focused calm of someone who had decided fear was not an option available to him right now. They lay side by side in the dirt, and Daniel remembers the sky above the ridgeline, that impossible blue that Afghanistan had no right to, clear and indifferent and almost insulting in its beauty, given what was happening underneath it. "You think about dying?" Marcus said, between bursts of fire. "Yeah," Daniel said. "What do you think happens?" "I don't know." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I think it's like before you were born. Nothing. But not scary nothing. Just quiet." Daniel looked at him. "That's unexpectedly philosophical for a man who's currently bleeding on me." Marcus almost laughed. Almost. Then his face shifted, the way faces shift when men get very serious very fast. "If I don't make it out of this valley," he said, "I need you to go back. Go to my mama, my sister. Take care of them like they're yours. Stop talking like that. Promise me, Daniel." "Marcus, I need to hear you say it." And Daniel looked at his best friend, bleeding in the dirt, in a valley on the other side of the world, from everything either of them had ever known, and he said it. "I promise." 11 minutes later, when the air support arrived and the firing stopped and men began moving again, a single shot came from a position they hadn't cleared. It wasn't meant for Daniel. He will never know for certain what happened in the geometry of that moment, whether Marcus saw it coming and moved deliberately, or whether it was simply the random, terrible lottery of combat. What he knows is that he felt Marcus push him, hard, sideways. And then Marcus was down. Daniel carried him. 200 meters down that hillside, with rounds still occasionally cutting the air, screaming into the radio for the medevac, talking to Marcus the entire way, Stay with me? Stay with me? We're almost there. Stay with me. Even after he knew, somewhere beneath the adrenaline and the noise and the desperate animal need to keep moving, that Marcus was already gone. The medevac team confirmed it 12 minutes after touchdown. Daniel sat on the ground beside the helicopter and didn't move for a long time. No one made him. That is one thing the Army does understand. There are moments you don't rush a man through. He received the Bronze Star 3 months later at a ceremony he barely remembers. His commanding officer said things about courage and valor that Daniel heard from a very great distance, as if the words were being spoken in another room to someone else, about a day that had happened to a different person. He put the medal in its box. He shipped the box home with the rest of his things. He never opened it again. What he kept instead was the photograph, the one Marcus always carried inside his helmet. A woman in her 50s with a warm, wide smile standing in front of a small white house with blue shutters. On the back, in Marcus's handwriting, Mama, home, everything. Daniel carried that photograph through the remaining 4 months of his deployment. He carried it through the flight home. He carried it into his parents' house in Valdosta, where his mother made him pot roast and his father sat with him on the back porch, and they watched the Georgia night without speaking for almost 2 hours. He carried it to Ohio 6 weeks later. Ruth Webb opened the door and looked at Daniel for a long moment. She was smaller than her photograph. Or maybe grief had made her smaller, the way it sometimes does, pulling people inward. She had Marcus's eyes, or Marcus had hers. That was the first thing Daniel noticed, and it nearly undid him on the spot. She hugged him without saying anything, long and tight and with the kind of physical certainty that only mothers possess, the knowledge that a body can say what words cannot. When she finally stepped back, she looked at his face carefully, not unkindly, searching. "You hungry?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, though he hadn't been hungry in weeks. She fed him pot roast and cornbread and sweet tea at a kitchen table covered in a yellow tablecloth, and Layla, who was 16 and trying very hard to hold herself together and mostly succeeding, sat across from him and asked him questions about Marcus, what he was like over there, whether he was scared, whether he talked about them. Daniel answered every question as honestly as he could without telling the part that mattered most. Yes, Marcus was brave. Yes, Marcus talked about them constantly. Yes, Marcus was scared sometimes, all of them were, but he never let the fear run him. He let the love run him instead. Layla nodded slowly, like she was filing each answer away somewhere deep and permanent. Ruth watched Daniel the whole time. He would notice, over the following weeks, that she watched him the way people watch something they're trying to understand, quietly, without pressure, with a patience that felt almost geological. He told himself he would stay 2 weeks, help with some things around the house, fulfill the promise in its most basic form, and then go back to Georgia and figure out the next chapter of his life. He stayed 7 years. It happened gradually, the way most profound things do, not in a moment of decision, but in an accumulation of small ones. He fixed the porch railing the 2nd week, and Ruth made him coffee afterward, and they sat and talked about Marcus as a child, stories Daniel had never heard, and he laughed genuinely for the first time since the valley, and the sound surprised him. He started looking for work locally, got a job at a hardware store, then a contractor who needed an extra pair of hands. He was good with tools, patient and precise, and the physical work helped with the nights, which were still bad, still full of a valley that turned blue sky and carried voices. He drove Layla to school on days when she missed the bus, which became most days, which became every day by the spring. He helped her with math homework at the kitchen table while Ruth watched television in the next room. And there was something in that ordinary routine, the scratch of pencil on paper, the smell of Ruth's cooking drifting in, the small, frustrated sighs of a teenager confronting algebra that felt like the first normal thing Daniel had experienced in years. He was careful never to try to be Marcus. That was the line he set for himself and held. He wasn't a replacement. He wasn't performing a role. He was just present, available, steady in the way that people who have survived unsteady things sometimes become. But the guilt never left. It was the permanent background noise of his life, quiet enough some days that he could almost forget it was there, loud enough on others that he had to sit in his truck in the parking lot of the hardware store for 10 minutes before he could go inside and function. The question that haunted him was not why Marcus died. War answered that question in its ugly, arbitrary way. The question that haunted him was simpler and more devastating. Why did Marcus push him? What had Marcus seen in that moment? What calculation had he made? What choice? What love? That had determined Daniel's life was worth the price of his own. Daniel didn't feel worth it. He felt on most days like a debt he couldn't repay, living in the house of the creditor, surrounded by evidence of everything that payment had cost. The years moved the way years do when you're not paying close attention to time, only to living. Layla grew up. She became a young woman with Marcus's laugh and Ruth's quiet intensity, and when she graduated high school, Daniel sat in those bleachers with Ruth and felt something crack open in his chest. Pride and grief and love all tangled together into something he didn't have a name for. Ruth's health began to decline when Layla was in her second year of college. First her knees, then her blood pressure, then the heart murmur that the doctor said required monitoring. Daniel went to every appointment. He learned the names of her medications and the timing of each one. He cooked more, cleaned more, arranged his contracting jobs around her schedule without ever making it a conversation or requiring acknowledgement. Ruth never made him feel like a caretaker. She made him feel like a son. And that was the thing that hurt the most, because he knew on some fundamental level that he didn't deserve it. He was living inside the love of a woman whose son was gone partly because her son had chosen to save him. And every act of kindness she extended felt like something he had taken from Marcus without permission. He tried once to talk to a VA counselor, drove 40 minutes to the office, sat in the waiting room for 30 minutes, and then left before his name was called. He told himself it was because he was fine, which was such an obvious lie that he was almost impressed with himself for attempting it. He wasn't fine. He was functional, which is a different thing entirely. Functional means you get up, you do the work, you show up for the people who need you. You perform the daily rituals of a living person with enough conviction that most people believe you. Functional is what happens when fine is no longer available, but stopping is not an option you're willing to consider. Daniel was functional for 7 years. It was a Thursday evening in late October when everything finally came open. Layla was visiting for the weekend. Ruth had made a large dinner the way she always did when the house was full. Too much food, exactly right. Afterward, Layla helped with the dishes, and Daniel sat on the porch watching the neighborhood settle into night, streetlights flickering on one by one down the block. Ruth came outside and sat in the chair beside him. She had a blanket over her knees and a cup of tea she held in both hands, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was not unusual. Comfortable silence was something they had built between them over years of practice. Then Ruth said, without looking at him, "You know you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Daniel went very still. "I know what happened in that valley," she said, her voice quiet and steady and kind. "I know he pushed you. I know you tried to save him. I know you've been living inside that fact every single day since you walked through my front door." The night seemed to get quieter. The streetlight down the block flickered once. "There was a letter," Ruth continued, "about a year after, from a soldier in Marcus's unit, a young man named Torres. He said he didn't know whether to send it, but he thought I deserved to know. He told me what he saw from his position on that hillside." She paused. "He said Marcus saw the shot coming, and he moved without hesitating. He said it was the clearest, most deliberate thing he'd ever seen a person do." Daniel felt something behind his eyes that he had been holding back for 7 years begin to move. "I've waited," Ruth said, "because I could see you weren't ready. A mother knows when to wait." She finally turned and looked at him, and her expression was something Daniel would spend the rest of his life trying to find the right word for. It was not pity. It was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implies a wrong was done. It was something closer to recognition, the look of someone seeing another person fully, finally, without the distance of silence between them. "My son loved you," she said. "He would have made that choice 100 times. And I need you to hear me say that, and let it mean something." Daniel put his face in his hands. He didn't cry quietly. He didn't cry with dignity. He cried the way men cry when 7 years of holding finally lets go all at once, in long, breaking waves, with the kind of sounds that are embarrassing and human and completely beyond control. He cried for Marcus, and for that valley, and for the blue sky above the ridgeline, and for every morning he'd woken up and heard that voice saying, "Promise me anyway." He cried for the bronze star in the box, and the photograph worn soft at the edges, and every meal at that yellow tablecloth kitchen table. Ruth put her small hand on his back, and she kept it there. She didn't tell him it was okay. She didn't offer words at all. She just stayed, the way she had been staying from the very beginning, steady, present, immovable, and she let him come apart completely so that something real could be put back together in its place. Layla appeared at the screen door at some point. She looked at the two of them on the porch, and she seemed to understand, the way young people sometimes understand things they haven't been told, and she went quietly back inside. Daniel started seeing a counselor the following month. He drove the 40 minutes, and this time he stayed. It was not easy, and it was not fast, and it did not fix everything, because nothing fixes everything. That is one of the lies we tell about healing, that it is a destination you arrive at rather than a direction you keep choosing. But things shifted, slowly, genuinely, in the way that real shifts happen, not dramatically but unmistakably, the way a season changes not on a single day, but across 100 small mornings, until one day you look up and realize the light is different. He talked about Marcus in those sessions. He talked about the valley and the promise and the guilt that had shaped 7 years of his life. He talked about Ruth and what it meant to be loved by someone who had every reason to look at you with pain and chose instead to look at you with grace. He talked about what it felt like to be saved by someone and whether you could ever fully accept that gift without first accepting that you are worth saving. That last part took the longest. Marcus Webb's grave is in a cemetery outside his hometown in Ohio. Simple white stone, military issue with his name and dates and the seal of the United States Army. Daniel goes twice a year, in spring when everything is coming back to life, and in late October, around the anniversary. He brings no flowers. He stands for a while in whatever weather the season offers. He talks, not loudly, in the way people talk to the dead when they have long stopped being self-conscious about it. He tells Marcus about the news, about Ruth's health, about Layla's career, about the house and the neighborhood. He talks about the contracting business he eventually started, the guys he employs, the work that fills his days with something purposeful and concrete. Sometimes he talks about the counseling, about what he's figured out and what he's still working through. Sometimes he just stands. On a visit 3 years after that October porch night, Daniel said something he had been working his way toward for a long time. "I think I understand the promise now," he said. "You didn't ask me to carry the grief. You asked me to carry the love. I got those confused for a while. He was quiet. I'm trying to get it right. The wind moved through the grass of the cemetery with a sound like distant breathing. There is a kind of courage that the military does not train you for and does not give medals for. It doesn't happen on a hillside or in a firefight or in the clean, urgent clarity of combat where the body knows exactly what to do. It happens in kitchens and living rooms and VA waiting rooms and cemetery visits in late October. It happens in the slow, unglamorous work of deciding every single day to keep living with the full weight of what you've experienced, not to forget it, not to outrun it, but to carry it forward into something that honors the people who didn't come back with you. Marcus Webb was 23 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his sister's stubbornness and a laugh that filled every room he was ever in. He wrote letters home every week. He kept a photograph inside his helmet. He loved with the uncomplicated, absolute certainty of someone who had decided love was the organizing principle of everything he did. In the last moment that mattered, he proved it. Daniel Reeves is 51 years old. He lives in Ohio, 15 minutes from the White House with the blue shutters. He has coffee with Ruth on Sunday mornings. He is the person Layla calls when she needs advice she can't get from a book. He employs 6 men and builds things that stand. He still wakes sometimes in the gray hours before dawn and hears the valley, the blue sky, the silence after. But he stays. He gets up. He makes the coffee and watches the light come back into the world and carries the love forward into another day. Because that was the promise. He understands that now. Not, if one of us dies, the other will survive. But if one of us can't go on, the other will go on for both of us. And some promises, the ones written not in ink, but in the irreversible currency of sacrifice and love. Those are the ones that never expire. Those are the ones that make a life.